curious how you navigate guys in their avoidant tactics with those emotions and how you get them to be present to process them.
I know that I feared myself getting stuck. I had this, and it's again, now I laugh about it a little bit, but I had this fear that if I experienced my sadness or my fear, that I would get stuck there, that it would be a quagmire, that I would just lose all the other parts of me that were like exciting and expressive and competitive and all that stuff. And so one of the first things that I have to correlate, I think, with guys is that being in touch with your emotions doesn't take away anything else in your life that you're doing, that you're passionate about, that you're excited about. And so it's not a zero sum game. It's actually additive. So the more in touch you are with yourself, the better you are at making good decisions about things happening in the outer world, including relationships, including job performance, including competitiveness. And you can, by knowing yourself and not being derailed by emotions you don't understand or you're avoiding, you actually are more effective and more present wherever you are. And so I try to get that message across. And I think guys experience it and they go, wait a second. Yeah, I'm in touch with my fear, but now I know what to do with that. I now have some, then we can talk about, well, how do you want to handle the fear of public speaking or the fear of being assertive in your relationship? Let's talk about that. And then we can come up with strategies that maybe help channel some of that emotion, or some of that emotion we might take in and say, I wonder what that fear is really about. Let's try to, in therapy, explore where that fear is coming from. Because on the surface, it looks like you should be confident or you should be okay with yourself. And yet there's a part of you that's obviously not. Let's go there and try to understand that and reconstruct that and find out where that came from. And then once they find out where that came from, they have more options. It's like, yeah, that's my dad talking to me, telling me I'm not good enough. Okay. Well, let's in therapy talk to your dad a little bit, symbolically, and find out what's true about that and what's your relationship like with your dad. And all of a sudden it becomes like, oh, that's my dad issue that I don't need to bring into my work right now, because that's not really what's really going on. What's really going on is I'm being triggered by something my dad said to me when I was a teenager, and I need to work on that. And so I think, again, I say it like it's like no big deal, but what I do is I try to help guys expand their sense of their inner complexity, not in a way that overwhelms them, but in a way that helps them like sort out why they are the way they are, which then gives them the opportunity to make adjustments and also compare it to the reality of the situations they're in right now, and see if those, if they're being triggered by something that doesn't really have anything to do with the current situation, then they can see that and they understand where it's coming from. So again, I'll stop there because I said a lot of things.
No, I think that's the best case for processing emotions that I've heard, which is essentially like the emotions are messengers and they're trying to tell you something. And just imagine all day you're being bombarded with positive, insightful, valuable messages that essentially you're ignoring. And then you're expecting that you're going to make a right decision or respond in an effective manner. Those two don't line up. And then I think that's where the internalized shame comes in of like, well, what's wrong with me because I just can't do this thing or I just can't understand this situation or concept. And I think it's trying to get out of this like, well, what's the problem that needs to be fixed or the outcome that needs to be finalized, and back up. And it seems like a lot of this just starts with naming that basic, or let's say foundational notion that just kind of opens up the path to the processing and deeper understanding and the decision making.
Exactly. And what happens when you don't know that, like you said, the shame feels like all encompassing, when it really is an issue that's being stirred up and that you're a very deep and complex person, and all you're seeing is shame. It's like an all or nothing. And the suicide rate among guys is 4 times that of women. So I think what we're onto here is that when guys don't process that stuff, what happens is they take it on themselves. They must be defective. There's something wrong with them. And it might just be they're breaking up with their girlfriend, or it might just be they can't get the job they want or something like that. Or it could be they're drinking too much. And all of those are just problems to be solved in reality. And yet what it feels like is I am bad. I am a screw up. I can't live with this pain. I can't live this way. Therefore, I'm going to take myself out because I'm not worthy. And it's like, oh my God, like that's sad to think that that's the thought process that's being driven by an emotional state that could be broken down. That's why I do the work I do.
Yeah, I resonate with that a lot. And I think that speaks to how when you're isolated, you have no other point of reference socially to know it's appropriate, to know it's normal. And that seems like the power of these groups. And oppositely, things like screens, and you mentioned this earlier, porn addiction or not even having close guy friends, really creates this sense of isolation. And many of the men I talk to, and myself included, then all that's left is essentially the worst possible assumption your brain can think of about yourself and essentially the best about that person, right? You create a ton of separation because of the internalized shame that says, well, I could never be equal or resonant with what this other guy is struggling with. But the reality is, if you ask any guy, whether he's a CEO, an actor, someone successful on paper, or someone that's living in their mom's basement, we all tend to share the same insecurities and fears and emotions. Take me back to 1982 when you were a graduate student at Missouri, starting one of the first therapeutic men's groups. What were you and Sam Cochran seeing in men that made you think they needed something completely different from traditional therapy?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Obviously I've been doing this for a long time, over 40 years, and my perspectives have changed. But to go back to that time, I was a young man. I was in my mid 20s, and Sam and I were really good friends. We had met each other in the program, and were working in the counseling center, and noticed that there was a lot of the support was for women who were mainly the clients in the counseling center, and there weren't that many men. And the men we were seeing felt pretty isolated and alone and pretty ambivalent about sharing what was going on inside of them. And both Sam and I were pretty connected and thought, this would be a really good thing to have guys who we've been seeing individually come together and like talk to each other because they'll see they're not alone. A lot of the issues that young men were experiencing back then are similar to the issues that we have now. Obviously, it's more complex, but back then it was the norms for traditional masculinity were even more powerful. We were also in central Missouri, which again is kind of a place where those norms are probably even more pronounced. And what we were seeing were guys who were kind of depressed, suicidal, anxious, and not being able to talk about it. And usually were coming to counseling because they were forced to. Things were getting acted out. And so they were being referred to counseling. They weren't voluntarily coming. And so when we started this group, the idea was to like at least let these guys not feel alone with what they were experiencing. And that turned out to be a really good assumption. And so I've been doing groups ever since. In fact, I just had men's group last night. I don't know what year this is of the group I've been doing in Redlands, but we started in 86. So this would be year 39 of doing men's group. So
Wow. How did you position the men's group to these guys? And I'm curious if that positioning how much it's changed to present day.
yeah, I think we were at that time a little more structured, and we're coming up with, actual issues that guys who have followed traditional masculinity are going to have trouble with. And again, the era of that time was women's rights and women's movement. And so there was this sort of strong sense that women were starting to feel empowered. and the focus was on them. And so guys were seen as, like they were the norm. And so it was really uncomfortable for guys to talk about things that weren't comfortable with them. And yet they were having relationship issues. They were having, mood swings. They were drinking too much. There was just so many things happening. And so, and in today's world, add on addictions, porn, stuff on the internet, not going out of the house because you can kind of access instant gratification right there. And so there's even more, I think, isolation happening today than there was back then. Back then, we didn't have the internet. Everybody was just, I know it's hard to imagine, but it was an era where, it was probably like there were like three TV channels and PBS. And that was the norm of like how people were getting their like societal information and newspapers.
Yeah, so that's interesting because it seems like, given that limited exposure to the everyday person, to other forms of living with other people, it seems like in some ways the traditional was the norm because of the historical precedents and because that was essentially the everyday man's like main exposure. They wouldn't have had an option to really hear someone talk about it differently unless they met someone like you. I don't know if I'm picking that up correctly, but
Yeah, yeah, no, that's right. It was sort of in that era, it'd be mind blowing to talk about, it's okay to cry, or it's okay to be in touch with your inner emotions, or whatever. It would be more like, get your shit together. That would be more the message that guys were getting. Like pull it together, man. Stop whining, stop crying, stop feeling sorry for yourself. And again, there's a part of that that's okay. I don't want to, you know, downplay that there is something about persistence and perseverance in the face of adversity that's an important part of being a man. But there's also that we're a much more complex being than that. That's sort of the external part of us, not necessarily the internal.
yeah, I agree with that. And I'm curious, like in those groups, what made it so effective to be around other men for guys to make progress, I guess, versus individual therapy?
Well, what's interesting is I think that guys learn from each other. Like last night, we talked about love in the group. Okay, so I'm just bringing you into the present. We talked about love and loving more than one person and being committed in a marriage and yet being attracted to women and stuff like that. And like that discussion doesn't happen unless there's a space for that to happen where the trust has been built. And so back then, the idea that guys could just share a part of themselves and then hear someone else go, "Oh, I feel the same way," or, "Hey, let me tell you a story about what happened to me." All of a sudden that defensiveness on the outside sort of melts away, and you don't realize how much energy goes into maintaining the front, the persona. And so just letting down that front and persona frees up energy, and guys move from feeling like depressed and overwhelmed to like having some sort of like sense of aliveness. And that was the most powerful thing I think I saw.
Do you think, is it safe to say that women naturally do that in their social bonding in friendships? And because men don't, a men's group in particular seems like the equal to how women do that naturally through friendships?
That's a good point. I think that probably culturally and maybe through evolution, women have been encouraged and reinforced to talk to each other, to share what's really going on, and to be okay with that inner emotional life. Now they have other things they not need to deal with, and some of that has to be, around being in the world with men and being in the world of competition and things like that. So they have things to grow on as well. But I think, yes, I think they are more comfortable. They're more socialized. What happens, I think, for little boys, and I think it still happens. I think I've talked to you before about I have a 3-year-old grandson who's really super expressive. It's awesome to be around him. He talks, he shares, he feels, he dances, he's spontaneous. And I remember, clearly when I was about 6 years old, that I was basically told to stop doing that. I was basically put into either a structured environment at school, and then it was reinforced not only by, teacher norms, but by peer norms that I was supposed to be a little man, that I was supposed to shut down some of that exuberance and some of that emotional expressiveness. And I was like artsy. I drew, I painted, I did all this stuff, and I kind of shut it down. And I think that's the cultural aspect of it. I think boys have a natural, and especially with testosterone in adolescence and stuff like that, a natural tendency to be more active and expressive in terms of the external world and maybe be a little more competitive. Maybe that's biological, but they still have this other part of them that it's almost like we turn off the screen, the inner screen, and be like, that don't pay attention to that anymore. Pay attention to the external world. You're going to compete with all these other boys for money, for girls, for all this stuff. So get on it. And all that inner stuff doesn't really get processed. And yet it's happening. So there's sort of an unconscious, and I think probably in today's world, the addiction to porn and stuff like that is because there's still parts of them that want something that aren't, they don't know how to do it. They don't know how to access it. And so, the instant gratification, oh, I know how to turn on my computer. Okay. Like that doesn't really take a lot of work, but actually learning how to be intimate in a relationship, talking to girls, talking to women, talking to, other men, like that part, we don't really teach very well.
My estimation of the modern man and the extremes is they're either like hyper productive and suppressing those emotions through workaholism and achievement and success, and I put all those in quotes, or the opposite. They're kind of giving into this hyper hedonism, where it's just like porn, weed, video games. I'm not really trying to work. I'm not really trying to date. And it seems like both are avoiding processing the emotions, and it just almost feels too simple to be true that so much of our issues and the symptomology we experience, I believe, is just a ineffective response to when we feel an emotion. And I think our ability to help guys name that as normal, but not sit in it. And that's probably where I think therapy has disconnected from men is there's a lot of affirmation. There's a lot of, okay, it's okay to feel that way. And the boys can cry and all that stuff. And I think that's a good start. I think if we can't at least start by acceptance, then you can't really go any further. But I think where it's failed men is essentially just saying, okay, and that's enough, right? And then I think a lot of men are saying, well, now what? And there's that kind of deeper desire to change after that acceptance, because part of what they have to accept as true might not be what they want to accept as appropriate or want to keep, right? And so I mentioned another guy hearing a guy's story feels like, yeah, me too. There's something in that. What is it? Like, what is that power, that magic of resonating with another guy that feels so healing and empowering?
It's hard to put it into words, but I think the way I imagine it is that normally if you come into a relationship, there's a guard that's up because of past distrust. If like I go back to my 3-year-old, he doesn't have any bad experiences yet. And so he's totally open to the world. He's open to me. He's open to, and until something goes down that maybe hurts him or whatever, he'll learn like, wow, when I go into this situation, maybe I need to be a little more guarded. Or I need to be like, put my wall up. Okay. And so what I think's happened for most guys is relationships with other guys tend to be either competitive or they tend to be a side by side. Let's watch sports together. And there isn't a space for that open conversation about what's going on beneath the surface. And if you've had brothers or if you've had a good family situation, it's much easier to go take that wall down and be like, I can trust people. I can trust. But if you've had experiences of, being ignored or isolated or abused or competed against every time you open yourself up, then you're going to have a very strong, and I talked about it earlier, like kind of persona that is, metaphorically or archetypally a warrior. Like, I'm not going to let you know me because you could take advantage of me. And so what that does is creates separateness. And so the process is in a men's group is that we are mutually taking the walls down. We're mutually saying, I'm as exposed as you are. We're all coming in here and we're allowing ourselves to be real, and we're going to say what's really going on. And that's the deal. And it's mutual. And so in a group, if a guy's quiet and three of the guys are talking a lot, there's usually stop and go. And I'll usually say, Jim, how's that feeling for you? Because you haven't said anything. And it's really important for Jim to then go, I'm just overwhelmed with emotion, or I'm like, you guys are talking about stuff that I think about all the time and I don't know what to say or whatever. That's enough of a revelation to say, he's actually paying attention. He's in there. Even if he can't contribute, it sends a signal to the other guys, like he's putting his wall down too. So I think there's something about, and again, I'm talking, I'm evolving as I speak about this, but I think there's something about the magic of letting down the energy that it took to kind of keep that external persona up. And it frees up energy to look internally and to also feel some connection with another guy. Now, one of the things that is a little more advanced, and I think, again, especially in a heterosexual guy, is that intimacy with other guys feels weird, and that typically that's usually done with a woman who you're going to have sex with or a partner. And so the sexuality part gets kind of in there in a weird way because you've associated being open and vulnerable with sex. And here I'm being open and vulnerable with another guy. Does that mean, and this is the homophobia part, does that mean I'm gay? Does that mean, like, because I'm mixing up sexuality and intimacy? And so one of the keys, I think one of the goals I have in men's group is to help guys differentiate that, to be okay with intimacy as something that's very human, and it makes you feel better and you feel connected, you get more energy, you feel supported. Wow, what could be bad about that? And yet if your model is, I only do that with a woman who I'm having sex with, then that could feel threatening, I guess.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's something I want to deep dive into because I think there's something there too with the porn and how we view sex nowadays. But I think what came up for me in that is just how many guys I talk to that either don't know how to make friends or don't know how to deepen the relationships with their friends, and I have gotten several texts already this year from buddies that they're newer friendships. And, they're just like, dude, do you know of any groups that will like talk about these topics X, Y, and Z or get real, And it's fascinating because on the surface, again, these guys have friends and they're more extroverted or, they are socially appropriate. They're not like awkward or, weird or anything. And yet there's that barrier to almost taking what happens, let's say in the men's group into the friendships. And I'm wondering for a guy that understands the power of men's group, either directly by participating in them or indirectly by just hearing about them, like maybe on a podcast like this or in general, and they're ready to say, how can I remodel that and emulate it in my friendships? Whether that's starting to make friends who would resonate with my values and would be reciprocal and opening up, or if I already have friendships, like going there and deepening them. Where do you start with a guy walking him through that?
Well, I think part of it is, in a way, it's a mindset around curiosity, around openness, around rather than judgment. I think one of the things that gets in the way is that oftentimes we're forced to like make judgments about things. That guy sucks, or that team's bad, or whatever. And so we have almost like a framework that you have to kind of like weigh in, versus I'm curious why you think differently than me, or I'm curious about that, you know, like, so it's like almost like asking the question that doesn't ever get asked. So, you know, you're hanging out with somebody and maybe, I don't know, they're smoking weed together or something like that. And that might be a way to kind of break down. I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying like that might be a situation and you're playing a video game. Then, you know, some statement might come out that you know, might not feel like you feel go, well, that's weird. You know, like a guy says, you know, man, I love this game, but I wish I had a better job or something like that. And instead of just going, yeah, man, that's the whatever, boo, 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 you go, hey, talk to me about that. What do you mean? You know, like, you know, I didn't know you didn't like your job, or I didn't know, like, tell me about that. Cause I always wonder about, you know, whether I'm doing the right thing or not. And all of a sudden you're under there. And it's because of just openness and curiosity rather than judgment. And judgment gets in the way. It's almost like we have to sort things out. And again, our minds are like that, but there's, you know, our minds are malleable as well. And I think that being willing to just be curious about things rather than judge them is the to me a really big step to intimacy, because you're showing interest in another person. All of us are, you know, we can't leave our bodies. We're 24 hours a day, us. And so when someone shows interest in you, that's an opening. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a threat. It's an opening that you're being seen, and it feels good to be seen. And if you can mutually see each other, then it feels like you're not so alone in your existence. And so again, we do it with people like, you know, like as when I'm a therapist, you know, people come in and they're paying me to see them. They're paying me to ask those questions. They're paying me to be present with them. If we could just do that in our everyday life, there wouldn't be as much need for therapists.
As a fellow therapist, I totally agree.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating, right? I mean, I've had clients literally tell me, like, you're the only person in my life that I talk to about stuff. And I have this like conundrum, right? Because in some ways it is healing to ask those questions and to be there. And in some ways it's grappling with like, well, gosh, like I'm also not your friend. Like I am a professional and we should be here knowing that like I could never replace, let's say, that role someone has. But I think that's a really simple but effective way of going deeper with your buddies. And it reminds me of a lot of Bowlby's work with attachment theory of like the only thing that is worse than a negative response is an apathetic or a negating one. And it's like, it drives us mad, right? I mean, this really happens in my marriage where, you know, I would way rather my wife just say something a little mean or harsh because at least I know she's caring, she's paying attention than if she just ignores me and it drives me mad. And I think in those social bonds, that's what a lot of us are experiencing with our male friendships is this insecure attachment because what is internalized, going back to the shame, is well, they probably don't care. Or if they're not paying attention, like, why are we even friends? And those are things that I think we all experience, but are too afraid to name. And I think we should be more confident in calling out as actually a sign of strength, not weakness. Again, going back to internalized homophobia, it's like, well, I don't want to seem weak or like I need someone. And these are all things where it's like, well, of course you need someone. Of course you are going to be let down by others. But it's what you do with the disappointment and hurt that matters. You know, it's like I had a situation recently, a buddy, unfortunately, both his parents have passed in the last year. And a really good friend, but over the last like 6 months has just not really responded to my texts, not really followed up, has not shown any initiative. And I went back and forth like, do I bring it up to him? Like, I feel bad. He's gone through a lot. And at the end of the day, I thought, I think he wants me to bring it up to him. Like, I think he would respect me for doing it. And I just did it in this casual way of like, hey, man, listen, I know you've been through a lot, you know, validating. I know it's tough. Um, what you've been going through. But yeah, I just want to say I felt a little disappointed in just our lack of communication in your response because And I want to drive home this point. I was like, I really want to be there for you in this time of need, but I don't really know how because I feel like I just don't really know where you're at. And he like took a second and paused and was like, you know what? Like, you're totally right. I just fell off the cliff, but it just means a lot that you followed up. And I think I'm there now. And that sounds like, holy shit, that's like, well, maybe I'm patting myself on the back, but that seems like more advanced than where a lot of guys may be. But it only took a lot of previous situations where I felt awkward, but I gave into the fear and I didn't say anything. And then I either got resentful or disappointed, or I just kind of ignored it and pushed it down. But I felt that internalized tension. And it sounds like what you're saying is if we can stay curious and open and not close that door within ourselves to our buddies, then if the door never shuts, then it's not going to be hard to open in a sense because it's not like you swing it wide open the whole time. That's obviously not good. But at the same time, it seems like many of us have kept the door shut for so long. It seems like we're having to like really bang it to get it open to make those connections.
You say it really well, and I think that example is great, by the way, of you reaching out and taking the risk, and to say, but it wasn't like, "Hey, dude, what's wrong with you?" It was, which would have been a judge, but it was more like, "Hey, I miss you, and I want to be there for you, and I've been feeling disconnected." And all of a sudden, that's truth. That's your truth, and you're being caring, and all of that is coming across. You're being compassionate while you're also actually confronting him on his lack of communication, and that's the perfect model of how to do it. It's not that, you know, it's again, it's I this gets back to, this is another topic we can go into, but I feel like you have to learn to have a relationship with yourself first. You have to treat yourself like you would a really good friend. And that means like understanding who you are, understanding, your strengths and weaknesses, understanding when you screw up, and, like talking to yourself in that way. And once you start to do that self acceptance, it's much easier to see it in other people and be self accepting of them, accepting of their foibles or their like ghosting you, and you're like, "Oh God, it feels really weird." Okay, there's probably, my curiosity side goes, I wonder what's going on with them. Because normally they wouldn't be doing that. So there's something going on. I'm curious rather than they don't like me. I must have said something wrong, or they just don't care about me anymore, which you could come to that conclusion based on the behavior. And yet that's inaccurate, most of it. So I feel like once you start to be kind to yourself and compassionate to yourself and understanding yourself, it's much easier to see that in outside of yourself. And it works the other way. If you're beating yourself up and you think you're a piece, it's really easy to see how other people are screwing up, and you focus on that instead of, like, I wonder what that guy's about. It's more like, that guy probably is blah, 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 which is all projection.
Yeah, and it seems like those narratives so easily bombard our psyche. And I'm wondering, when it comes to self awareness and self acceptance, what are some really simple, basic tools a guy can start to do to not just immediately accept those narratives that infiltrate his mind with the judgments and assumptions? Yeah, what are some things that a guy can do to start to change the way he goes about that?
Yeah, I think one is to go into the mindset of like, hey, I need to get to know myself better in order to function better in the world. Like, does that make sense? Yeah, I mean, that's hard not to argue it. So I'd say like that's step one. I would say step two is to acknowledge that I'm kind of a complex person. I'm not that simple. It's easier for me to be simple because then I don't have to think very much. I like to sleep, I like to eat, I like to, but in reality, I've had a lot of experiences. I've encountered a lot of things. It's not always easy to sort all that stuff out. I have some complexity. And then to put structure on the complexity, I like to use the model, and this is kind of a masculine model of, you have like an inner team or an inner boardroom that has different parts of you that are talking to you all the time. So the part of you that's competitive, is saying, come on, you're going to need to do better. Blah, blah, blah. And there's another part of you that's saying, I'm tired. You've been pushing it a lot. Maybe you need to slow down, whatever. There's another part of you. I'm, you know, I'm a maybe a father. I need to be a good father. I need to be a good husband. I need to do the right decisions when I'm doing that. Another part of you might be like, I've always had this fantasy that we're going to be great or we're going to do something really important. And so all these voices, and there's 20 more of them, and I'm trying to overwhelm somebody, but to identify what parts are talking to you. Because I think when you feel shame or you feel depressed or you feel angry, it's not all of you, but it's a part of you that is raising their voice in the boardroom and saying, this isn't right. Something's not right here. And so you, as the self, have to kind of like listen to all those parts and decide, what do I want to listen to? Right. Well, right now I got to go, I got to get dressed for work. So I need to like be in my executive functioning self, which is to like make sure I get dressed, eat breakfast, and go to work. Like that's what I have to do first. I will get back to you part that is angry about something. We need to address that. I'm not sure when, but I can't address it right now because right now my executive self says we need to get to work. And so once you start to have that inner conversation, it's much easier to kind of break down problems and sort of identify where they are and also to not take them as all or nothing. Like if I'm angry, I'm just an angry person. No, there's a part of you that got triggered that's angry right now. Let's figure out who that is. So I think to start out, it's more like exploring, different elements of who you are and to almost imagine your different pieces rather than just see yourself as a monolithic self. Now, how to do that? It's much easier to do that with therapists. It's much easier to, I'm a journaler. We've talked, I've journaled for 50 years. So I like to like put it on paper so that I can go back to it or, whatever way you do it, can be on a computer or phone or something. So I try to like have that be like a touchstone to remind myself that, there's issues going on and like I have a way to look at them and that it gives me a space to take time to be that part, my self-reflective part. I need some time for self-reflection. I like to get up early in the morning. That's my self-reflection time. I spend a lot of time, just my current self, getting up right at the crack of dawn. There's something about that feels really good to watch the sun come up or the light come in. And I kind of get a big perspective on my life, where I am, how old I am, what am I doing? What am I doing with myself? How do I feel about my relationship? All that kind of stuff is really easy to access. I might have had a dream about somebody that I, think about. It's like, wow, I haven't thought about that person in a long time. Might write some things down. This morning I was looking in the mirror and I'll go, God, I can see my dad. I can see my dad in me. Wow. I haven't been thinking about that. It was kind of cool to see that. And I was like, okay. So it's again, being curious about yourself.
It brings up for me, one of the most famous books, I think, in general, that a lot of people have read, and particularly men, is, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. And it's so easy to overlook, like, those were journal entries. Now, part of me is like, oh, they must have been curated. They're so damn good and cohesive. But you know, part of me is like, oh, actually, he probably just had such a dedicated practice to journaling that, it appears so natural, but it took a lot of effort. And it sounds like what you're saying is it's the daily commitment just to giving yourself the sacred space, even if it's 5 minutes, to make sense of the day or yourself and just let it out, that is so therapeutic. And a lot of what therapy at its best does is just giving people the space to make sense of their life, to slow down, to really tune in. And then the second thing that came up, and I don't know why this has just never occurred to me, but I think we as society have done men an injustice by just calling them simple as a race. Just saying, oh, guys are so simple. All they want is, food and sex and money or something like that, and I think what you're bringing up is the reality that just like your 3-year-old grandson, it's just like my 19-month-old son, we're so complex, and it's so obviously natural that we're complex because that is expressed until we do hit, 6, 7, 8, or really middle school is where I tend to see a lot of boys shift into that more like unnatural stoic expression. And it seems like our ability to hold things in paradox and complexity and presence is what really defines us as mature men, not because we've figured things out or we can prove things, which in my estimation are the two ways most men want to bond or feel most secure in is, can I either prove something, like debate wise, or can I solve like a problem? Can I feel useful as a person? And I think when we gently put those aside and realize that relationships aren't meant to do either of those, but you brought this up earlier, is this sense of being known, then we can realize that that in and of itself, maybe is the whole point.
Right, exactly, exactly. And that and it's sort of existential in the sense that it kind of brings us together. It makes you feel part of the big human community a little bit more. You start to realize that, yes, you're a unique individual and you have a unique consciousness, but you're also part of something bigger. Sometimes, I think religions and movements of that spiritual movements have tapped into that idea that, like we're not alone. And I think a lot of what people get out of going to church or synagogue or, a mosque is the connection, is feeling like you're not alone. And you may not believe all the stuff they're saying, but what they're basically saying, most of them are here, you can take down your walls and let your heart be out there. And we can like praise whatever God is, because God may be just that feeling of like what you're naturally about, what your natural curiosity is about without all the walls being up. And so ironically, I think a lot of times warrior culture has said you have to be a warrior. It's your lot in life for men, or you have to be a hunter, or you have to be whatever. And this believing in something bigger was actually an externalization of what's inside of us.
Yeah, I mean, trying to be the John Wayne or the lone wolf, these things that are so removed again in isolation, and realizing when you're part of a spiritual community, whatever that looks like, you are subjecting yourself to the transcendent, but also the collective morality, meaning like what is best for you does not stop at you. And I think many of us men are so self-centered and we've lost that sense of the greater good of what we're aiming towards. And you mentioned this in a previous conversation about how sports teams in the military have been incredibly successful at creating deep bonds by helping men focus on a greater good or a vision. But obviously, most guys aren't going to join the Marines or play football. So I'm curious. There's a lot of this talk about the death of third spaces. That there used to be spaces where men could congregate outside of church or the military or sports. But I'm curious, what does the modern day equivalent look like that actually helps men get a sense of brotherhood and purpose?
Think that's part of why I think there is a need for men's groups, because I think that that's, guys are starting to realize that they don't have that third space anymore. You might experience it as your kid gets older, like being like a little league coach or something, and the other dads whose kids are on the team, you might be able to like have good, deep conversations, as part of that experience. So I think part of it is just being open to new venues where you could actually encounter other men. I mean, I'm also a poker player, so I like, and poker is a defense game. It's a front, and yet it's all humans, and most of them are guys, and I can bring my authentic presence while we're playing the game. I could re-raise somebody while talking to them in a friendly way. Like it doesn't really, it's a game. And so I think finding spaces like where maybe you can like join with other guys, like doing an activity that seems interesting to you, and then that activity is the vehicle to be encountering other guys that you can then talk to, whether it could be at the gym, it could be golfing, it could be bowling, I don't know, whatever. There's a whole bunch of ways to do that, but the main point is to like get yourself out there, is to put yourself out there. And that's not always easy if you don't trust yourself or if you're in defense mode or you feel threatened by other guys. But if you're okay with yourself, that's why I say the inner work, it starts with the inner work. If you start to feel okay with yourself, you can then project out into the world. There's probably other guys out there that also want to connect like I do. And so if I take the chance to put myself out there, I'm more likely, I increase the probability of meeting guys and having some sort of connection with other people. And if it doesn't work out, okay, like it probably won't work out with everybody, but it's sort of like my card analogy, which is if you don't play the hand, you're never going to see what the cards are. You can fold right away and just be like, that's not my. I had a guy talking about, he used to do acting and he's been feeling isolated and was thinking about joining an acting group, and he brought it up in the men's group and everybody was like, yeah, you're cool. And then he started to say, yeah, but I'm not okay. And I said, why don't you stand up and do a one man act on why you don't want to be an actor? And he got up there and he was great. And everybody was like, whoa. And he allowed that, whatever you want to call it, the shadow side of himself to just be super expressive about why he was not a good actor. And in the meantime, he came across as a very powerful presence. And I don't know if he'll go into acting or not, but it was like, he needed to express both sides of that in order to hear what his objection was. And then he also needed to hear the feedback from the guys in the group saying to him, you're freaking good. You convinced me that you shouldn't be an actor by doing this soliloquy in front of the whole group, standing up. You're very powerful. And so it's kind of an irony that he could do that.
Yeah, that's a really cool story. And another thing you brought up that we're not good at as men is complimenting each other, encouraging each other, these things. And you mentioned that you had gotten into poker somewhat recently and that you attributed some of your success that you're seeing in your ability to read people. And it seems like if you start with reading yourself and knowing yourself, then that attunement then allows you to do that with other guys. And going back to the fact that we all want to be seen, it's just simple acknowledgement of stuff. I mean, how it's not that hard, It's like if you like a shirt that a guy's wearing, or someone brings up that they're from Pittsburgh and you like football and you name that. It's just these little acknowledgments that guys are like, oh, yeah. And then that slowly breaks the crack. And then, people are open. But it just seems like that reading people and kind of knowing where there's someone's like fear or there's someone's excitement or whatever, and just allowing that to be named is kind of the way forward.
Right. And I would even add too that it sort of builds on itself. So there's a part of me that doesn't, like, even when a friend can't do something or somebody moves away, one of my best friends moved away, I have this trust that that opens a space for me to connect with some other people. I believe that. I believe that, when the opportunity will be there, I will seize it. I will take advantage of it. But I say this a lot, I trust my future self that even if something goes wrong right now, I will know how to handle it because I've handled things before and I have a good sense of who I am. And it's really just a problem to be solved or a situation that's going to stir me up. I'm going to use it as an opportunity to learn about myself. Like when I feel that way, then I don't walk around the world afraid. I walk around the world curious, not afraid.
It's powerful. And it seems like within that is the ability to have a life vision that is grounded in the self knowledge. And I'm curious, how does a guy develop a life vision or things to aim for in a way that gives him security in the now, to know that like his manifestation of that life vision is the clarity and the confidence that allows him to handle the situations?
Yeah. I think it has to do with slowing down and taking time to just be aware and curious of your own reactions, almost like you're discovering yourself. Like And I've had guys who, come at me from midlife who have never done that. And they go, I've been married 3 times. I can never hold on to relationships. I've changed careers. Something's off, and I don't know what it is. And so what we do is I ask them to just do this kind of, why don't you just look at yourself like as if you were looking at somebody else, like do an observation of how you handle different situations. And that'll give you a spot to focus on in terms of like where you're missing the boat in terms of relationships. There's one guy, like I'm thinking another men's group guy who has been wanting to be in a long-term relationship. He's been married several times. And what he does is he has like a very almost like criteria for who he's looking for. And if the person doesn't fit all the boxes, he's like, that's not going to work. And he moves on. And he got called out for that. He got confronted and said, you know, you're not at all, you're trying to skip ahead to the end goal, which is to find somebody. And you're doing it by checking boxes and, doing match.com and all that stuff. And what the guys were saying to him is, what if you just allow the relationship to unfold and enjoy the process along the way, and if it ends up being a long-term thing, great. If it doesn't, you still got an experience that was worth having, that's going to help you in terms of, your future relationships. And you might get some enjoyment out of doing it while it's happening. And it kind of blew his mind that he was like, yeah, you know what? I've never been a process guy. Like I've always wanted the structure. I always want the goal. I want to go from point A to point B to point Z. And the guys in the group, there are some guys in the group who are more process oriented, and he's like learning from them that it's okay to be process oriented. Like, oh, they get something from that. I've always been afraid of that. And then we could explore what are you afraid of? And it was, what he was afraid of was he was going to do it wrong, that he was going to be judged, that he was going to be told that he wasn't good enough. That's what's underneath all that. And once he started to acknowledge that, he could then say, is that a true statement? Am I really that bad? And then the guys in the group, this is the beauty of the group, were saying, man, we've seen you move from being like a really rigid character to somebody who's kind of fun and open, and it's visible. Like I experience it with you right now, that you're more easy to talk to than you've ever been, than I've ever known you. And all of a sudden he can start to take some of that in, and that fuels his own inner, exploration and growth.
I think a word that comes up for me as you say that is just seeing the unfolding of your humanity as an adventure. It's not this thing that you figure out, and it's not a right or wrong, and it's not a task, and it's not a moral thing, but it's just this genuine excitement, and to use your word earlier, curiosity of just being like, yeah, like, who am I and what's going on? Not as these daunting questions that should feel like they are value judgments or provide pressure, but just almost as these really light but intentional guides that kind of allow
Exactly.
you to follow this path. And yeah, I'd like to end with circling back on the male intimacy and the internalized homophobia. And yeah, I guess I'm just kind of trying to sort out how we made that correlation to begin with, I think, in society, and a way forward. Because if I think about it, if you look at, let's say, from an ideological perspective, uh, people, I think, who are more left or liberal progressive miss the mark by saying like there's no shared resonance of what a man is like. There's no set definition. There's no shared or common experience. And it kind of becomes this abstract and amorphic thing that if you try to define it, then that's too limiting and that's marginalizing. And I think a lot of men say, well, like, gosh, this might not be all of me, but it certainly feels true. When I talk to a lot of guys, this is, feels resonant. And then on the right, I found more of the traditional, rigid and limited views of masculinity, which is like it can only look this way, it can only do that. And if you stray away from it, and if you do anything besides that, then it automatically falls into some sort of homophobia or, some sort of unacceptable expression of manhood that I think is hurting a lot of guys. So I'm just curious, for a guy that is trying to explore his masculinity and doesn't want to fall into those extremes, what feels like a way he can be open and curious, but also protected, where it feels like there's some guardrails and there's some sense of like structure and intentionality in that exploration.
Yeah, I think you're saying it as you described the question. I think that it's okay to have both goals in life, to have perspective, to educate yourself in whatever way. It doesn't have to be academics necessarily, but educate yourself in some kind of career path or activity that you want to be good at. And it also is important to kind of understand your inner self. We do have we have male bodies, there's brain chemistry that is different for people born men and people born female. And so, acknowledging that is okay. It doesn't, yes, we're all human, but we do have some distinct qualities that are different. And maybe because our bodies are bigger and stronger for the most part, we have been designated the warriors or the protectors or the providers. And that we live in a world now where it's not all about like fighting for, physical strength isn't the thing, which makes sense that why women would be like, even though I have a female body, I can still be a tough CEO of a company. Just because I can have a kid doesn't mean I'm a weak. And so I think that what has to happen is more of an integration of, accepting yourself, accepting your body, accepting your desires and needs, and then figuring out in the current situation, this is where flexibility comes in. I'm an advocate of flexibility, that you are going to be at your best when you read the room, when you read the poker table, when you read the situation and figure out that, me being a tough guy in this situation makes sense. And here I'm in a different situation. Me being an open, reflective person makes sense to be here. And if I'm going to be in a situation where I want to make good relationships, then I need to be more of that. And if I'm in a situation where I'm going to compete and I'm being told that, like there's only going to be 3 people chosen and, there's 100 people being, assessed, then I got to put out my best stuff. And that means, not necessarily cracking and saying, oh, I'm so scared that I'm not going to be chosen, but to know that part of yourself well enough to go, that's not the part I need right now. The part I need right now is for me to come into this with confidence and energy and show that I have the stamina or the persistence part of me that can do this work. And then after that experience is over, maybe you go and do something with your kid and you're back to being this open, loving person. It's like the flexibility to move from situation to situation, person to person. Like that to me is psychological health for men. And it integrates, I think, all different versions of what we've defined as masculine.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. That word integrity comes up. And I think to encapsulate it is a really simple analogy of stretching. A lot of men, including myself, are very active and love to, lift weights or run, whatever. And I'm terrible at stretching. I'm super stiff. But I think within that, there's a really powerful message that correlates to the self awareness, which is, and the parts of like, okay, I can be stereotypically masculine. Part of me can reside equally to this stereotypically feminine side. And both are true, both are real, and both are not just need to be expressed, but also in a way like work together like a dance, like everything has a role. But I think within the stretching, it just seems so simple and unnecessary. And okay, it takes time. And what's the point? It's not going to lead me to, let's say accomplish things, or it's not obviously feeling good as far as, yeah, just making progress. But it's actually the very thing that prevents injuries, that allows you to maximize the muscles that you're using. and the very thing that's going to keep you healthy long term. And it seems like as a
Exactly.
man, our ability to be self aware, to integrate our parts and to name them, to stay curious, kind of is all wrapped up in that.
Agree.
Well, thank you for taking the time to chat. There's a lot of wisdom I'll be thinking about. And I'm curious where people can find your work.
Well, you can just look me up on the internet. I've written 5 books. The last book I'm working on a book right now called Strength with Heart. It's not out yet. But the last book I talk about men's groups. So it's called Deepening Group Psychotherapy with Men. It follows 10 guys who I work with individually, and so you see their individual issues. And then the second half of the book is they go to a men's group. And so you see how they interact with each other, having learned about who they are. So it's kind of I think it's a great book for guys who are even going into a group to just kind of see what could happen to them. And obviously I'm a professor, so I teach counseling. I supervise other therapists. I have a private practice. I have been an administrator. I've just take on different things. I'll brag a little bit that I got to play in the World Series of Poker as a super senior and went very deep in the tournament for 3 days and, cashed. And I just take everything on with this kind of openness, curiosity, and I try to learn as much as I can. And I don't know, if there's much more to my life than that. Is just like I'm going to be present wherever I am. I'm going to bring that presence, and that feels like a good way to live life. And Wes, I think you're even doing this podcast. I think you're trying to help guys figure out how to best be in the world in a way that's just healthy for them, but also healthy for all of us. And I appreciate you doing this.
Mm. Well, I take that in and I want to honor how long you've been doing men's groups. And, I think to your point, a lot of them are starting to pop up. They are by a lot of guys, my age or around my age. And I think that's a really good thing. I also just think I want to especially thank you for committing to sticking with it so long because I think one thing I constantly hear is what I have heard it said as grandfather energy, this kind of more polished, hey, I've been there. I don't have all the answers, but I certainly have some thoughts and experiences to share. And for anyone listening, I would just highly recommend, Fred's work in his book because I think there's a certain perspective that only comes through, hours in the saddle that I think I'm certainly gleaming from. And, while I'm eager to take the baton, I realize I can't run too far ahead without realizing what's been done. So just thank you for kind of charting this work and all those years where it wasn't a hot topic. And it certainly feels appreciative to work together for the good of men. All right, guys, until next time, thank you.